Husband passed on a Tuesday. By Friday, I was back at work. People thought that was strange. My daughter called me 3 times that week begging me to take leave, and my son drove 4 hours from Cincinnati just to sit in my kitchen and watch me make coffee. But I couldn't stay in that house and stare at his recliner. I just couldn't. So I went back to work and I kept going back, and eventually the night shift opened up and I took it because the extra pay helped and because nighttime in an empty house is a different kind of quiet than daytime. Daytime quiet is just absence. Nighttime quiet has weight to it. It presses down on you. I am Sylvia Beaumont. I am 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a medical billing specialist at a regional hospital outside of Cleveland, and for the last 4 of those years, I worked the evening shift. I left the building every night at 11:15, and every night I called the same car service to take me home. That was how I met the driver. His name was Felix. He was in his late 40s, maybe early 50s, with a quiet way about him that I appreciated. Some drivers want to talk the whole ride home. Felix wasn't like that. He drove and let the city pass by outside the window, and if I wanted to say something, I could, and if I didn't, that was fine too. He had a thermos on the console every night, and one time I asked him what was in it, and he said black coffee, no sugar, because sugar put him to sleep. I told him that was the opposite of how it worked for most people, and he smiled at that. Just a small smile, the kind that doesn't ask for anything back. After that first conversation, I started bringing him something from home. Nothing elaborate. I'm not the kind of woman who makes things elaborate. I bake on Sundays because my husband and I always baked on Sundays, and after he was gone, I kept doing it because stopping felt like losing him a second time. So I had biscuits, or I had a slice of pound cake wrapped in foil, or I had a little bag of the pecan cookies my daughter says I make too many of. I'd leave whatever I had on the seat next to me and tell Felix it was there if he wanted it. He always took it. He never made a fuss about it, never said, "Oh, you didn't have to," the way people do when they don't really mean it. He just said, "Thank you," and sometimes, if it was cookies, he'd take one before we even pulled out of the hospital lot. That was the rhythm of things for almost 2 years. I didn't know much about his life. I knew he had a daughter because he mentioned her once when I was talking about mine. I knew he'd lived in Cleveland his whole life. I knew he'd done something else before driving. He mentioned it once and didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. People have whole lives behind them that they're not ready to hand over to a stranger, and I respected that. I figured if he wanted me to know, he'd tell me. What I didn't know then was that he was paying attention, not just to the road, to everything. Let me back up a little and tell you about the house situation, because that's where all of this started, even if I didn't know it at the time. When my husband passed, the house went to me outright. We'd paid it off 7 years earlier, and the deed was in both our names, so there was no complication there. But what I didn't account for was my husband's younger brother, a man I'll call my brother-in-law because that is what he was and what he tried not to be. His name doesn't deserve space here. My husband and his brother had been estranged for about 12 years. I knew the general shape of the reason: money, a loan that never came back, a father's death, and a will that one of them contested. But my husband never wanted to go into the details, and I never pushed. Some wounds you leave covered. For 12 years, the man was just an absence at Christmas and a name I didn't say out loud, and that was fine with both of us. Then my husband died, and 7 months later, a letter arrived. It was from an attorney I didn't recognize, out of Akron. The letter said that my brother-in-law believed he had a rightful claim to a portion of the property based on a verbal agreement made between the 2 brothers before my husband and I were married. He was asserting that my husband had promised him co-ownership of whatever home he purchased in exchange for a loan made in 1987. The letter was polite in the way that threats are sometimes polite. It said he hoped we could resolve this outside of court. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after I read that. Then I called my own attorney, a woman I'd used for estate paperwork when my husband's mother passed, and she told me not to respond to the letter directly and that she'd look into it. She called me back a week later and said the claim had no real legal standing. There was no documentation, no signed agreement, nothing, but that people filed these things anyway sometimes, especially when they knew a surviving spouse was alone and might not want the trouble. Might not want the trouble. That phrase sat with me for a while. I told my daughter, and she was furious. She wanted to call her uncle directly, and I told her not to. I told my son, and he drove up again, and we sat in the kitchen again, and I told him the same thing I told her. Let the attorney handle it. There's nothing to handle. This will go nowhere. What I didn't tell either of them was that I was scared. Not of losing the house. The attorney had been pretty clear about where things stood legally. I was scared of something I couldn't quite name. I'd been living alone for almost a year by that point, and my brother-in-law knowing that felt different than a stranger knowing it. He'd been to the house before. Years ago, but still. He knew the layout. He knew the neighborhood. He knew I was there by myself. I started double-checking the locks before I went to work. Both deadbolts, front and back. I'd started leaving the light in the front room on a timer years before, which I kept doing. I didn't tell anyone about the extra lock checking because I didn't want to hear myself say it out loud. Saying it out loud would make it real in a way I wasn't ready for. This was the fall. October into November, and the nights were getting long, and the parking lot at work had those overhead lights that buzzed and left half the lot in shadow. I walked to the car line every night the same way, past a guard station, and Felix was always there or there within 2 minutes. One night in late November, a different car showed up. It wasn't Felix. It was a younger man, newer car, and he said Felix had a family thing and had sent him in his place. I almost didn't get in. I stood there in the cold for a moment, and then I got in because it was 38 degrees, and I was tired, and the app confirmed the car and driver. The ride home was fine. Nothing happened. But I didn't sleep well that night, and I couldn't have told you exactly why. When Felix came back 2 nights later, I asked about his family thing. He said his daughter had a fever. Nothing serious, she was better now. I told him I was glad, and I handed him a piece of the apple cake I'd made that weekend. He took it, and we drove in the usual quiet, and I felt the particular kind of relief that comes from things going back to normal. But things were not entirely normal. I could feel it without being able to say where the feeling was coming from. The attorney had sent the response letter to my brother-in-law's attorney, and there had been no reply for 6 weeks. My daughter said that was probably good, that it meant he'd realized he had no case and was letting it drop. My son agreed. I tried to agree too. I checked the locks every night before I left for work. In early December, something changed. It was small. Probably nothing, I told myself, but when I came home one night, Felix dropped me at the corner as usual. I walked the half block to my front door. I noticed that the welcome mat was slightly off-center, just a few inches. My husband had placed that mat himself, and he was particular about things being square, and I had kept it square out of habit. It could have been the wind. It could have been anything. I went inside. I checked every room. Nothing was disturbed. I locked both deadbolts and went to bed and lay there looking at the ceiling for an hour. The next night, I told Felix. I don't know why I told him specifically. I hadn't told my daughter or my son about the mat. I think it was because I was in the car and the dark was outside and he was just there, and it came out. I said I'd been having some trouble with a family member and that it was making me jumpy. I said I'd noticed my mat out of place. I said probably nothing. Felix didn't say probably nothing. He said, what kind of trouble? I told him the outline. Not all of it, but enough. The letter. The claim. The brother-in-law I hadn't spoken to in 12 years. He listened without interrupting, which I noticed because most people interrupt. When I finished, he was quiet for a minute. Then he said, "Has anyone been around your house? Car you don't recognize, anything like that?" I said I didn't know. I walked that half block in the dark most nights without looking around, the way someone who was worried would look. I just went inside. He nodded slowly. He didn't say anything else about it that night. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that Felix had been noticing things I hadn't. He told me this later. He said that for about 10 days, off and on, when he dropped me at the corner, he'd seen the same car parked down the block. Dark blue, older model, Ohio plates. He'd thought little of it the first couple of times. People park on streets. But then it was there again, in a slightly different spot, and then again, and he started waiting after he dropped me off, watching until I got inside and the door closed. He didn't tell me because he didn't want to frighten me without being sure. The night everything changed, he was sure. It was a Wednesday, cold, the kind of Cleveland December cold that gets into your coat. I'd worked late covering for a colleague, and I was tired in a bone-deep way that's hard to explain to anyone who hasn't worked a long shift and then had to sit with numbers for 2 extra hours. Felix picked me up at 12:40 instead of the usual 11:15. He was quiet, as he usually was, but there was a different quality to the quiet. We were about 4 minutes from my street when he said, "I'm going to drive past." I said, "Past what?" He said, "Past your corner. I'm going to go around the block once, and I want you to look out the window and tell me if you see anything." I started to ask why, and then I thought about the mat. I thought about lying awake, looking at the ceiling. I said, "Okay." He drove slowly. When we came around onto my street, I looked, and there was the dark blue car parked half a block down from my house, engine off, lights off. There was someone in the driver's seat. I could see the shape of a head. I said, "That's not a car I know." Felix said, "It's been there before, a number of times while you were inside." My chest went cold, not tight cold, like the temperature of the air had found its way through the glass. He drove around the block again. He didn't raise his voice. He spoke very calmly, which I was grateful for, because I was not calm. He said he was going to call the non-emergency police line, and he wanted me to call my son or daughter to come be with me, and he was not going to drop me at that corner until one of those two things had happened. He said, "You've been kind to me for 2 years. I'm not going to leave you on a dark street with someone sitting in a car watching your house." I called my daughter. She answered on the second ring, and I told her what was happening, and she said she'd call her husband, and they'd be there in 25 minutes, and to stay in the car. I stayed in the car. Felix drove slowly around the neighborhood, and I sat in the back seat watching my phone, and he called the non-emergency line and reported a suspicious vehicle, gave the street, gave the Strickton, gave the plate number. He'd written it down, I realized later. He'd actually written down the plate number on some earlier night, on whatever he kept on the console. He'd been watching out for me without telling me he was watching out for me, and the steadiness of that hit me somewhere I wasn't prepared for. The police sent a car. They came within about 15 minutes, and Felix and I were still circling, and I told my daughter that on the phone, and she said to keep staying in the car. When the cruiser pulled onto my street, the blue car pulled out. Felix was at the end of the block and we both saw it. He flagged the officer. They did a stop a few blocks away. The man in the car was not my brother-in-law. He was a man I had never seen before. A private investigator, it turned out, hired by my brother-in-law's attorney to document the property. That was the claim anyway. Whether surveilling someone's home at midnight qualifies as documenting property is something that turned out to be a question worth asking, and my attorney was very interested in asking it. My daughter and her husband arrived while the officer was still on the street. She got out of the car before it fully stopped and walked straight to where I was standing and put her arms around me, and I let her, which I don't always do. I'm not someone who usually lets people hold me when I'm frightened. But she held on, and I let her. The attorney filed a complaint on my behalf the following week regarding the manner of surveillance, and it changed the character of the negotiation entirely. My brother-in-law's attorney went from asserting a verbal agreement to asking if we might discuss the matter privately and informally. My attorney said no. The claim was dropped in January. I called Felix when it was resolved and told him. He said he was glad. He asked if things felt settled now, and I said yes, mostly, the way things can feel settled after something that's taken up space in your chest for a long time. He said he understood that. I said I thought he probably did. I asked him once, sometime in February when the nights were still long but the worst of the cold had passed, why he'd started writing down the license plate, why he'd paid that much attention. He thought about it. He said his own mother had been alone after his father died. He said there was a stretch of about 2 years where he hadn't lived near her and hadn't called enough, and he'd spent a long time afterward wishing he'd done things differently. He said he'd gotten used to noticing things after that, paying attention to people who were managing on their own. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "Is your daughter okay, the one who had the fever?" He said she was great. He said she'd just made honor roll. I told him to tell her congratulations from a stranger who was rooting for her. He smiled in the rearview mirror and said he would. I still work the evening shift, though I've told my supervisor this coming spring will be my last year. 63 is not old, but my feet tell me otherwise after midnight. And my daughter has started saying things about having the grandchildren know me while I'm still willing to get on the floor with them. She's not wrong. There's a version of my life in the next few years that involves sundaes and biscuits and small people underfoot, and I'd like to be present for it. Felix and I still have the same rhythm. I bring something from home. Last week, it was a slice of the cranberry bread I've been making since I found my husband's mother's recipe card in a box I hadn't opened since the move, and he takes it without making a fuss, and we drive through the Cleveland night, and mostly we're quiet, and the quiet is fine. My daughter asked me once what I would have done if Felix hadn't said anything that night, if he'd just dropped me at the corner like always. I said I didn't know. Maybe nothing would have happened. Maybe the investigator was just watching the house, and that would have been the end of it. Maybe not. What I do know is that 2 years of biscuits and pound cake and Sunday cookies added up to a man who paid attention when it mattered. I didn't bring him those things because I expected anything. I brought them because my husband always said, "You treat people the way you'd want to be treated if you found yourself in their position, working late, driving through the cold, carrying a thermos because sugar put you to sleep. You notice. You show up. You say thank you without making it into a production." I think about that a lot these days, not just what Felix did for me, but what it means that he was in a position to do it at all. The chain of small, ordinary things that had to happen. The night shift, the car service, the first conversation about the thermos, the biscuits, the 2 years of being decent to each other in the dark. Most of the time, kindness doesn't save your life. Most of the time, it just makes a Tuesday a little more bearable for someone who's carrying something heavy. But every now and then, it does something more than that. Every now and then, it means there's someone who notices when a car has been sitting on your street too many nights in a row, and who stays to make sure you get inside. That's enough. That has always been enough. I've thought about the chain of things that had to line up for that night to end the way it did. Felix had to notice the car the first time, then notice it again. Then think to write down the plate number, not because anyone asked him to, not because it was his job, but because something in him said, "Pay attention." That's not instinct. That's character. That's what it looks like when a person has trained themselves through loss and regret and quiet years of doing better to actually show up for people instead of just moving through them. And I had to bring the biscuits. I had to keep bringing them week after week without expecting anything back. Not because I thought it would ever matter in some dramatic, life-altering way. Just because my husband used to say you treat people the way you'd want to be treated if you were the one working late in the cold. I did it because it was the right thing to do. And then I did it again, and then it became who I was in that small daily space between the hospital and my front door. That's how cause and effect actually works, I think, not in thunderbolts. In accumulated choices. In the slow, quiet accumulation of how you treat people when nothing is at stake and nobody is watching and you're tired and you just want to get home. Felix told me his mother had been alone once and he hadn't called enough, and he spent years afterward wishing he'd paid more attention. That regret built something in him. It made him sharper, more present, more willing to stay an extra few minutes and watch to make sure someone got inside safely. His grief turned into a kind of vigilance, and that vigilance, on one cold December night, made all the difference. That's not luck. That's a man who took something that broke him and made it into something useful. I think about what I might have done differently if I'd been less stubborn about being fine. I could have told my daughter sooner about the mat being moved. I could have mentioned the unease I'd been carrying for weeks. I didn't. Partly because I didn't want to worry anyone, and partly because admitting fear out loud felt like giving it too much power. That's a kind of courage I don't entirely recommend. Holding things together on your own has its place, but so does knowing when to say something feels wrong and letting the people who care about you respond to that. What I learned, what I'm still learning, is that strength isn't silence. Strength is knowing what you know, saying what you see, and trusting that the people around you can handle hearing it. My daughter handled it. Felix had already been handling it, quietly, for 10 days before I even knew to be worried. We are not meant to navigate everything alone. That doesn't mean you fall apart and hand your problems to other people. It means you stay upright, you keep going, you do the decent thing every day. And you also let someone else write down a license plate number when you're too tired and too scared to think of it yourself. That's all. That's really all there is to it.